Hey guys, so I have some fun facts about Andrew Jackson. If you want to stick around, I'll probably just be like, I don't know, 5, 7 or so minutes. Because he is a super interesting and very crazy person in American history. So let's start off with his early life. Andrew Jackson was born in what's called the Waxhaws, which is, you guys have heard of Waxhaw. It's just down the road. But it's like this area between North Carolina and South Carolina. Back then, the border like wasn't super defined, so we're not really sure if he was born in NC or SC. But both states claim him or don't claim him, depending on how his legacy is being viewed at that point. But anyway, so he was born in the Waxhaws and he ends up being orphaned at a pretty young age in his teenage years due to illness and sickness and stuff like that among his parents. At 12, though, he decides to join the Revolutionary War effort. He is he's 12, but he lies and he says that he's like 14 or 15. Not that he could join as a soldier, but he could join as like a scout or a spy or just kind of like do grunt work for the troops. Eventually, though, he is captured by the British and he is held as a prisoner of war. And when he's being held captive, a British officer tells him that he has to shine the officer's shoes. And young Andrew Jackson is like, I'm not going to do that. And his punishment was to get a slash in the face with the British officer's sword. So for the rest of his life, he has this pretty sick scar on his face, just kind of, symbolizing the brutality of his childhood. After the war, though, he never goes to college. He is known as a like a fun-loving guy, gambling, partying, flirting. He's fun to be around, but you definitely don't want to be on his bad side. He doesn't go to college or law school, but becomes a lawyer. And the way that that happened is he just kind of worked for lawyers for a while. He's kind of like an apprentice, and he learned everything he needed to learn from working for them. I don't really think that's a thing these days. Like, I think you do have to go to law school, and you definitely have to pass the bar to be a lawyer. But back then, it was like, do you know what you need to know? Okay, cool. So he's a lawyer, and he eventually moves to Tennessee. So his home in Tennessee, or his plantation, is called the Hermitage. It's a museum now. You can definitely go visit it. Andrew Jackson, though, is one of these presidents from the antebellum or the pre Civil War era that was a slave owner. He owned hundreds of slaves. He was also one of these people who didn't believe that the races could coexist together and that possibly sending slaves back to Africa, which none of these enslaved people had like been to, because at this point slaves were born into slavery; they weren't imported. Um, but he was a proponent of that idea, sending enslaved people back to Africa. All right. So let's talk about his love life for a minute. So Andrew Jackson was in love with a woman named Rachel. There's a picture of her right there. The problem, though, is that Rachel was married and she wanted to get a divorce. I think she was actually separated at the time. But back in the day, like women did not have legal rights. And so she could not initiate her own divorce or speed it up at all. So they were really just kind of at the mercy of her husband, her original husband, as to how quickly he wanted to divorce her. Eventually, though, she does get divorced officially. Andrew and Rachel get married, and they do it all the right way. But when they started dating, she was technically a married woman. And so many of Andrew Jackson's enemies use this as a way to kind of like get under his skin. Whenever they want to kind of pick a fight with him, they will use Rachel as the way to get to him. They'll call her like all sorts of awful, awful names. And one of these guys was a guy named Charles Dickinson. Uh, the legend here with this duel, now Jackson was in a lot of duels. Like the average that people can estimate is anywhere from like 12 to 100. It's a pretty big range. But he was in a lot of them and he did shoot, kill a few people. One of these people is Dickinson. Dickinson called his wife a bad name, and Andrew Jackson was like, "You've, hurt her honor. Let's duel it out." He let Dickinson shoot first. Jackson was shot in the chest, kind of near the heart, where that bullet stays for the rest of his life. The legend is that Jackson didn't even move or flinch or anything, just got his gun and shot Dickinson straight in the neck and killed him. So Jackson's a pretty scary dude. I would not want to be on his bad side. And there's a lot of people on his bad side. He had a lot of grudges. Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, both of them are not on Jackson's friend list. This is a alleged quote that Jackson said on his deathbed. I have only two regrets. I didn't shoot Henry Clay and I didn't hang John C. Calhoun. So he hates these guys, and we'll kind of see why in our notes. Another interesting thing about Jackson is that one of the farmers in America, when he was president, sent him a 1,400-pound cheese wheel, and Jackson let it sit in the foyer or the lobby of the White House and invited the public to come eat it. And within 2 hours, the cheese was gone, but it left kind of a grease stain on the floor for, I think, many, many years. The carpet had to eventually be replaced. So that's kind of cool. Okay, last two cool facts about him. First is that he was the first president to have an official assassination attempt against him. So here's a drawing of kind of what happened. The guy who ends up trying to kill Andrew Jackson, his name was Richard Lawrence, I think. Lawrence, what we can now today probably conclude was suffering from some type of psychological disorder. It was probably something like schizophrenia or at least some type of psychotic disorder that involves delusions, which are false beliefs. And Lawrence thought that I think like the King of England owed him land or something, and that Jackson was preventing him from getting the land. Kind of confusing, but again, these are delusions, so they don't really make sense to begin with. So Lawrence thinks that he has to kill Jackson. So he sees Jackson leaving a funeral in Washington, D.C. And this is before Secret Service or anything. So Jackson's just like walking around in public without any protection. So Lawrence goes up to Jackson and he fires one of his guns. And this is with Jackson's back turned. And apparently Jackson heard it. He turned around and he was like, what? But Lawrence was like, no problem. My first gun didn't work. I have a second gun. So he pulls his second gun out of his pocket and tries to shoot Jackson again. But that gun misfired too. So two guns misfired. Jackson comes at this guy with a cane. Jackson at this point, he's walking with a cane. And Jackson just like wails on this guy, like beats him over and over and over again to the point where he has to be like literally dragged off of Lawrence before he can kill him. Lawrence survives. Jackson obviously survives as well. Jackson also at this point is in his late 60s, and he just like almost beat this guy. And then in true Jackson form, he built a statue of himself where this assassination attempt occurred. So that's pretty crazy, the story of the first presidential assassination attempt there. Final thing about Jackson that's interesting. Jackson apparently had a pet parrot. Who knew? It cussed a lot, because I'm sure Jackson cussed a lot too. But it cussed so much that the parrot was at the funeral for Jackson, but the preacher had to have the parrot removed because it was being so vulgar in what it was saying. So, you know, you think you're cool, but if you had your parrot kicked out of your funeral, I don't know. All right, so I hope that you enjoyed these fun facts about Jackson, and it gave you a little bit more of a kind of a human perspective on him as a man. All right, that's the end.